Hello and welcome to ZzScience. I'm glad you're here. Take a moment to relax, let your body settle, and let your mind slow down. If you'd like, you can share in the comments where you're listening from. For now, let's slow things down and begin. There's something about the night that changes the way we think. When the noise of the day fades and the world grows still, our minds begin to wander toward questions that rarely appear in daylight. We start to wonder where we came from, what everything means, and why we tell ourselves the stories we do. Tonight, we're going to explore something that connects people across every culture and every era. Myths, those ancient stories that have traveled through thousands of years and still live quietly inside us, shaping how we understand the world and ourselves. Before we begin, let's settle in for a moment. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. Allow yourself simply to listen. This isn't a lesson or a lecture, just a calm reflection on something mysterious, beautiful, and deeply human. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to think hard or concentrate. Let the words move gently past you, and if you drift off to sleep along the way, that's completely okay. The story will still be here. Long before there were books or written language, long before cities and nations, there were people gathered around fires beneath vast stretches of stars. Our distant ancestors looked at the world with fresh, wondering eyes, as though everything was being seen for the first time. They watched the sun rise each morning and asked why. They saw storms roll across the sky and wondered where such power came from. They experienced birth and death, joy and suffering, and they needed ways to understand it. There were no encyclopedias to consult, no devices to search for answers. They had only their senses, their imaginations, and one another. So they began to tell stories. Not simple stories, but stories that try to explain the great mysteries. Why does the sun move across the sky? Where do we go when we die? Why do the seasons change? Why do we feel love, fear, anger, hope? These stories were not only entertainment, though they surely entertained. They were maps of the unseen world, attempts to give meaning and shape to forces that felt vast and incomprehensible. In a very real sense, myths were the earliest science, the earliest psychology, the earliest philosophy. They were humanity's first effort to understand existence itself. Imagine what it must have been like to live without modern knowledge. You don't know about gravity or planetary motion or meteorology. You don't understand disease, genetics, or the chemistry of fire. The world around you is full of power and mystery. Lightning tears across the sky. The ground shakes beneath your feet. Rivers flood, destroying everything, or dry up and leave you desperate for water. Animals sometimes seem strangely human, and other times entirely alien. Your own body behaves in ways you can't control or explain. You dream at night and experience visions that feel completely real. Someone you love becomes ill and dies, and you don't know why. In the face of so much mystery, the human mind does something extraordinary. It forms patterns. It makes connections. It builds stories. This isn't imagination spinning wildly. It is a profoundly intelligent response to complexity. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. Humanity survived partly because we could notice patterns in nature and use them to anticipate what might happen next. If the sky looks a certain way, rain may be coming. If an animal behaves a certain way, it may attack. If a certain plant makes you sick, you learn to avoid it. Pattern recognition kept us alive. But our minds don't stop at simple patterns. We go further. We create stories to link those patterns together, to give them context and meaning. And when we can't find a straightforward explanation for something, we fill in the gaps with the tools we have. We use metaphor. We use symbols. We project human qualities onto the non-human world because human behavior is what we understand best. That storm isn't just wind and rain. It's anger. It's a force with intention, with personality. The sun isn't just a bright object in the sky. It's a being, a traveler, maybe even a god who chooses to bring light each day. This is how myths begin, not as lies or superstitions, but as genuine attempts to make sense of reality using the most sophisticated tool humans have: storytelling. And here's what's beautiful about this. Even though we now know that lightning is electricity and storms are weather patterns and the sun is a star burning through nuclear fusion, even though we've replaced these mythic explanations with scientific ones, the myths themselves haven't lost their power. They still resonate. They still teach us something. They still shape how we think and feel. Let's think about one of the most common types of myths across nearly every culture: creation myths. Stories about how the world began, how humans came to be, how life itself started. Almost every culture that has ever existed has some version of a creation story. The details vary wildly. Some cultures say the world was born from an egg. Others say it emerged from chaos or void. Some say gods sang it into existence, or shaped it from clay, or thought it into being. Some say we came from the earth itself, or from stars, or from the bodies of ancient beings. Why are these stories so universal? Why does every culture feel the need to explain its origins? Part of it is practical curiosity. We naturally want to know where we came from. But there's something deeper too. Creation myths aren't just about the past. They're about identity. They're about meaning. When a culture tells a story about how the world began, they're also saying something about why they exist, what makes them special, what their place is in the grand scheme of things. These stories give people a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. They connect individuals to their community to their ancestors to the land, and the land to the cosmos itself. Imagine being a child thousands of years ago, sitting with your family around a fire as darkness falls. Your grandmother tells you the story of creation, the same story her grandmother told her. She speaks of the first days, the first people, the gods or spirits who shaped everything. As you listen, you're not just hearing facts, you're learning who you are. You're learning that you're part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the very beginning of time. You're learning that the land you walk on is sacred because it was formed in that first creative act. You're learning that the customs and rules of your people aren't arbitrary. They're connected to the fundamental structure of reality itself. This is what myths do. They anchor us. They give us roots. In a world that can feel chaotic and meaningless, myths say, no, there is order, there is purpose, you belong here, your life means something. And that's incredibly powerful. It's something humans seem to need on a very deep level. Even today, even in our scientific age, we still seek this sense of meaning and connection. We still want to know where we came from and why we're here. We've just found different ways to answer those questions. But creation myths are just the beginning. As cultures developed and grew more complex, so did their myths. New stories emerged to address new questions. What happens after we die? How should we treat each other? Why do bad things happen to good people? What qualities make someone admirable or contemptible? Myths evolved to tackle these questions too, and in doing so, They became something more than just explanations. They became guides for living. Think about hero myths, for instance. Nearly every culture has stories of heroes who face impossible challenges, overcome great obstacles, defeat monsters or enemies, and return transformed. The details change from culture to culture, but the basic structure remains surprisingly consistent. A hero begins in an ordinary world. Something disrupts that world or calls the hero to adventure. The hero leaves the familiar and enters the unknown, facing trials and dangers. The hero often receives help from wise figures or magical allies. There's a crisis point, a moment of supreme challenge. The hero either succeeds or fails, learns something crucial, and returns home changed, bringing back knowledge or treasure to share with the community. This pattern shows up everywhere. In ancient Mesopotamian stories, in Greek myths, in Norse sagas, in indigenous traditions from every continent, in religious texts, in fairy tales, in modern movies and books. Why? Because this pattern reflects something true about human experience. Not literally true, but psychologically true. We all face challenges in our lives. We all have moments where we must leave what's comfortable and venture into the unknown. We all struggle, suffer setbacks, need help from others, learn hard lessons, and hopefully grow from the experience. Hero myths give us a template for understanding our own journeys. They tell us that struggle is normal, that fear is natural, that help is available, and that transformation is possible. When an ancient person heard the story of a hero slaying a dragon, or descending into the underworld, or completing an impossible quest, they weren't just being entertained. They were learning how to face their own dragons, their own underworlds, their own impossible quests. Those dragons might be literal dangers, like wild animals or enemy warriors, or they might be internal struggles, like fear, grief, anger, or doubt. The myth doesn't distinguish because, in a sense, all challenges are the same. They all require courage, resourcefulness, persistence, and the willingness to change. And here's something fascinating. These myths didn't just teach individuals how to live, they taught communities how to stay together. Myths are almost always shared stories. They belong to groups, not isolated people. When everyone in a community knows the same myths, when they've all heard the same stories about heroes and gods and monsters, they share a common language for talking about life's challenges. They share values. They share ideals. If your culture has a myth about a hero who succeeded through honesty and courage, that myth reinforces those values in everyone who hears it. If another culture has a myth about a trickster who succeeds through cleverness and adaptability, that tells you something about what that culture values. Myths, in other words, are cultural glue. They bind people together by giving them shared reference points, shared metaphors, shared ideals. This is why myths were passed down so carefully from generation to generation, memorized and repeated with great precision. It wasn't just about preserving stories, it was about preserving the culture itself. Lose the myths and you risk losing the values and identity that make your community cohere. Let's slow down for a moment and think about memory. Not just personal memory, but collective memory. How does a culture remember its past when there's no writing, no photographs, no recordings? It remembers through stories. Myths are, among other things, memory devices. They encode important information in narrative form because stories are much easier to remember than lists of facts. The human brain is wired for narrative. We remember stories far better than we remember abstract information. Imagine trying to teach someone a set of moral principles by simply listing them out. Be brave, be honest, be loyal. respect your elders, care for the weak. It's not very memorable, is it? But wrap those principles in a story. Show them in action through characters who face real dilemmas and real consequences, and suddenly they stick. The story carries the lesson in a way that engages emotion, imagination, and memory all at once. This is why Jesus taught in parables. This is why every spiritual tradition uses stories. This is why even today, when we want to teach children important lessons, we tell them fairy tales and fables. But myths do something even more sophisticated than just preserving moral lessons. They preserve history itself, though not always in the way we might expect. Many myths contain echoes of real events, real places, real people, all transformed through centuries of retelling. A great flood myth might reflect an actual devastating flood that occurred generations earlier. A myth about warring gods might encode memories of real wars between tribes or cities. A story about a wise king might be based on an actual ruler whose deeds were so impressive they passed into legend, growing larger and more magical with each retelling. This is one of the fascinating things about studying myths. They exist in this space between fiction and history, between imagination and memory. They're not literally true, but they're not completely made up either. They're truth of a different kind. They're truth filtered through human meaning-making, shaped by what matters most to the people telling the story. And in some ways, this makes them more revealing than straight historical accounts, because they show us not just what happened, but what it meant to the people who experienced it, and how they wanted to be remembered. As you lie here listening, maybe your own mind is starting to drift a bit. That's fine. That's natural. In fact, it's perfect for thinking about myths, because myths themselves exist in that space between waking and dreaming. They have the logic of dreams, where impossible things happen naturally, where time flows strangely, where symbols matter more than facts. When ancient people created these stories, they were tapping into the same part of the mind that creates our dreams at night. The part that thinks in images and feelings rather than words and logic. The part that sees connections and patterns that our rational mind might dismiss. This is why myths so often feature transformations. People become animals. Animals become people. Gods take mortal form. Mortals become gods. Objects come alive. The dead return. Boundaries blur and shift. In the mythic imagination, everything is connected and anything is possible. This isn't primitive or childish thinking. It's actually a sophisticated way of understanding the world's complexity. Because the truth is, boundaries in life are rarely as clear as we pretend. The line between human and animal behavior can be fuzzy. The line between life and death is a process, not a point. We are constantly transforming, changing, becoming something new while remaining ourselves. Myths acknowledge this fluidity, make space for ambiguity and mystery. Consider myths about animals. In many traditions, animals aren't just creatures to be hunted or feared or domesticated. They're teachers, guides, spirits, ancestors. There are myths where animals sacrifice themselves to feed humans. Myths where animals teach humans essential skills. Myths where humans are descended from or related to certain animals. These stories reflect a worldview where humans aren't separate from or superior to the rest of nature, but deeply embedded in it, related to it, responsible to it. The animals in these myths aren't just symbols. They represent a kind of knowledge that comes from observing the world closely and respecting other forms of life. When a myth says that Raven brought light to the world, or that Coyote was a trickster who shaped the landscape, or that Eagle can see from the spirit world, these aren't just cute stories. They're encoding real observations about these animals and their behaviors, wrapped in narrative that makes them memorable and meaningful. Real ravens are intelligent problem solvers. Real coyotes are adaptable survivors. Real eagles have extraordinary vision. The myths take these real qualities and amplify them, making the animals into characters who can teach us something about those qualities. And it works the other way too. Myths about monsters and demons often encode real dangers and fears. Dragons might represent the fear of large predators or the destructive power of natural disasters. Sea monsters might emerge from the very real dangers of ocean travel. Demons and evil spirits might personify disease, madness, or the psychological terror of darkness and the unknown. By giving these fears a shape and a name, myths make them less overwhelming. You can't fight an abstract fear, but you can fight a dragon. You can't negotiate with the concept of chaos, but you can make offerings to a storm god. Myths give us handles to grasp things that would otherwise be too big or too formless to deal with. So myths serve all these functions at once. They explain, they teach, they remember, they bind communities together, they help us process fear and find courage. They give meaning to suffering. They celebrate beauty and mystery. They acknowledge what we don't understand while helping us live with uncertainty. That's a lot of work for a set of stories to do, and it's no wonder they became so central to human culture. But let's think about what happens as cultures grow and change. As small tribes become larger societies, as people settle in cities, as agriculture replaces hunting and gathering, as writing is invented and spreads, what happens to myths? Do they disappear? Do they become obsolete? Not at all. They evolve, they adapt. They become more sophisticated and more specialized, but they remain essential. In early cities, myths became codified in religious systems. Professional priests and priestesses became the keepers and interpreters of sacred stories. Temples were built, rituals were formalized, and myths took on official status. But this didn't make them less powerful. If anything, it made them more so. Now the stories were reinforced by institutions, by architecture, by art, by music, by regular ceremonial reenactments. If you were a citizen of ancient Athens, the myths of Greek gods weren't just stories your grandmother told you. They were carved into the Parthenon, sung at festivals, performed in theatres, invoked in courts of law. The myths shaped the entire landscape of your life. And as these myths became more elaborate, they also became more psychologically complex. The gods of civilized mythologies aren't simple. They're contradictory, flawed, passionate, petty, noble, terrible, and magnificent all at once. Zeus is both the king of gods and a serial philanderer. Athena is wise, but also fierce in battle. Apollo brings healing and plague. These aren't one-dimensional symbols. They're attempts to capture the full complexity of existence, the way that power and weakness, creation and destruction, love and cruelty can all exist together. Think about the Greek myth of Persephone. A young woman picking flowers is abducted by the god of the underworld and taken to live in the realm of the dead. Her mother, the goddess of harvest, grieves so deeply that all growing things wither and die. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of each year in the underworld and part on earth. When she's below, winter comes. When she returns, spring arrives. On the surface, it's an explanation for the seasons. But it's so much more than that. It's about loss and grief. It's about growing up and leaving home. It's about how death and life are intertwined. It's about a mother's love and the pain of separation. It's about how we all contain both light and darkness. It's about compromise and balance. Different people hearing this myth might connect with different aspects of it, depending on their own experiences. That's the beauty of these multi-layered stories. They mean something to everyone, while meaning different specific things to different people. This flexibility is actually one of the reasons myths have survived so long. They're not rigid doctrine. They're living stories that can be interpreted and reinterpreted. Each generation finds new meaning in old myths because the human experiences they describe, loss, love, fear, courage, betrayal, redemption, are timeless. The specific details of our lives change, but the emotional and psychological core remains recognizably human. As you listen to this, maybe you're thinking about stories from your own childhood. Fairy tales, perhaps, or religious stories, or family legends, or even books and movies that affected you deeply. Those are your myths. They might not be ancient, they might not be about gods and heroes, but if they shaped how you see the world, if they taught you something important, if they gave you metaphors, understanding your life, then they're functioning as myths. Myths aren't just old stories. They're stories that carry meaning across time, that connect us to something larger than our individual experience. And this brings us to something important. Myths aren't static artifacts from the past. They're alive in us right now. Every time you say someone is narcissistic, you're referencing a Greek myth about a man who fell in love with his own reflection. Every time you call something someone's Achilles heel, you're invoking a story about a warrior vulnerable in one specific spot. Every time you talk about opening Pandora's box, or going on an odyssey, or having a Midas touch, you're using mythic language. These stories are woven into our everyday speech because they're woven into our thinking. But it goes deeper than language. The structures of myths, those patterns we talked about earlier, still shape how we tell stories today. Movies follow the hero's journey because that pattern resonates with something deep in us. Love stories follow patterns established in ancient myths of lovers separated by fate or circumstance or divine intervention. Tragedies unfold according to patterns the Greeks identified thousands of years ago. Comedy, tragedy, romance, quest, voyage and return, rags to riches, rebirth. These basic plots appear in ancient myths and in modern stories because they reflect basic patterns of human experience. Even the way we think about our own lives is shaped by mythic patterns. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, where we've been, where we're going. We cast ourselves as heroes of our own journeys, sometimes as victims, sometimes as survivors, sometimes as seekers. We identify mentors and allies and obstacles in our lives. We mark turning points and transformations. We look for meaning in our struggles. All of this is mythic thinking. We're taking the raw data of our experience and shaping it into narrative, into meaning, just as our ancestors did around those ancient fires. The night deepens around you now. Your breathing has probably slowed. Your body has settled into stillness. This is good. This is the right state for thinking about these ancient, eternal patterns. In this quiet space, we can recognize that myths aren't something separate from us, something to study objectively from the outside. They're part of how we're made. They're part of the human operating system, and understanding them helps us understand ourselves. We've been talking about how myths began and what they do, but now let's turn to a deeper question. How do myths actually work inside the human mind? What is it about these stories that makes them so powerful, so memorable, so transformative? To understand that, we need to think about how the mind processes information, how it creates meaning, and how stories affect us on levels we're not always fully aware of. The human mind isn't like a computer that stores facts in neat folders. It's more like a vast, interwoven web of connections, where everything is linked to everything else. When you learn something new, your brain doesn't store it in isolation. It connects it to what you already know, to emotions you felt, to images and words and memories. The more connections something forms, the more deeply it becomes embedded in your understanding. And this is where myths excel. A myth isn't just a sequence of events, it's thick with meaning. It operates on multiple levels at the same time. There's the literal level, what happens in the story. The symbolic level, what those events represent. The emotional level, how the story makes you feel. The moral level, what values or lessons it carries. The psychological level, what it reveals about human nature. The cultural level, what it expresses about the society that created it. And finally, the personal level, how your own experience shapes the way you interpret it. When you hear a myth, all of these layers are active at once, often without your awareness. Your conscious mind follows the plot, while your deeper mind is recognizing patterns, responding to symbols, and generating emotional meaning. This is why myths can move us so deeply, even when we can't fully explain why. They speak to parts of the mind that don't work in words or logic. Consider symbols for a moment. Symbols are incredibly powerful carriers of meaning. Something small that points towards something vast. A cross, a crescent moon, a star, a tree, a mountain, fire, water. These are not just objects or elements. They carry centuries of human experience and association. When a myth uses one of these symbols, it taps into that immense reservoir of meaning. Take water, for example. Water sustains life. It cleanses, reflects, and renews. It can be peaceful or violent, nurturing or destructive. It hides unknown depths. It shifts between ice, liquid, and vapor. Across cultures, water appears in myth as a symbol of life and death, rebirth and transformation, emotion and the unconscious, purity and chaos, separation and passage between worlds. When a story describes someone crossing water, sinking into depths, or being washed by rain, all of these associations awaken in the listener's mind, whether consciously or not. A single symbol carries an enormous amount of meaning. The same is true for many mythic symbols. The sun evokes life, power, clarity, constancy, the realm of daylight consciousness. The moon evokes cycles, change, mystery, the inner world of night. Mountains suggest ascent, challenge, revelation, the meeting point of heaven and earth. Forests evoke wilderness, the unknown, trial, and transformation. These associations are not random. They grow out of shared human experience. Every person who has ever lived has known day and night, light and darkness, growth and decay. Myths speak in this universal language. But myths don't rely on symbols alone. They weave them into narratives. And narrative itself has a powerful effect on the mind. We think in stories. Even our memories take the shape of stories. When you recall your past, you don't store isolated facts. You remember a narrative, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. With yourself as a character, with causes and consequences, with meaning. Myths provide the templates for these inner narratives. They give us story shapes we can recognize and inhabit. When something happens in your life, you often understand it by placing it into a familiar pattern, a journey, a trial, a fall, a return. You might think, this is my hero's journey, or "This is my dark night of the soul," or "This is my exile and return." These patterns come from mythic and spiritual traditions, and using them helps us process our experiences. They reassure us that what we're going through has been lived before, that it has shape, meaning, and the possibility of resolution. This is actually quite comforting. When you're going through something difficult, it can feel chaotic and meaningless and endless. But if you can think of it as a chapter in a larger story, as a trial that heroes have faced before you, suddenly it becomes more bearable. You can see yourself as a character in a story, rather than just a victim of random circumstances. You can imagine that this trial has a purpose, that you might grow from it, that it will end and you'll emerge transformed. This is the psychological power of myth. It gives us frameworks for making meaning out of chaos. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just a comforting illusion? Isn't it self-deception to impose narrative meaning on events that are actually random? Maybe. But here's the thing. Humans need meaning. We can't function without it. A life that feels meaningless is a life that becomes unbearable. This isn't a weakness or a flaw. It's part of how we're built. We're meaning-making creatures. We create culture, art, religion, philosophy, science, all of which are ways of making meaning. Myths were one of the first and most powerful tools we developed for this essential task. And whether the meaning we create is objectively true or not might be less important than what it allows us to do. If thinking of your struggle as a heroic trial gives you the courage to face it, if it helps you find resources within yourself you didn't know you had, if it connects you to others who have faced similar challenges, then that meaning is functionally true. It's true in its effects. This is what myths have always done. They've helped people find the courage to live, to face death, to love, to sacrifice, to create, to endure. Let's think about fear for a moment, because fear is something myths deal with constantly. Humans are vulnerable creatures. We face threats from nature, from each other, from disease, from accidents, and ultimately from death itself. Fear is a natural response to these threats. But fear can be paralyzing if we let it overwhelm us. Myths help us deal with fear by giving it form, by naming it, by showing us characters who face fear and sometimes overcome it. When a culture creates myths about monsters, those monsters represent real fears. But by making them into characters with names and attributes, the myths make the fears less overwhelming. The dragon might represent the fear of violent death or chaos or the unknown. But once it's a dragon with a specific appearance and specific behaviors, it becomes something that can potentially be understood and confronted. The hero who fights the dragon is showing us that courage is possible, that fear doesn't have to be the final word. And here's something interesting about how myths handle fear and danger. The heroes don't usually succeed because they're fearless. They succeed despite their fear. The stories acknowledge that fear is natural and appropriate. What matters is what you do with it. Do you let it stop you, or do you act anyway? This is a much more realistic and helpful message than pretending that brave people don't feel fear. Myths teach practical courage, the kind that acknowledges fear but moves forward anyway. Death is perhaps the ultimate fear that myths address. Every culture has myths about death, about what happens after, about the realm of the dead, about the possibility of return or rebirth. These myths vary enormously in their details, but they all serve similar functions. They help people face mortality, their own and others. They provide comfort in grief. They suggest that death isn't the absolute end, that something continues, whether it's an afterlife or reincarnation, or living on in memory, or merging back with nature. Are these myths literally true? That's not really the point. The point is that they help us live with the reality of death. They give us ways to think about it, talk about it, ritualize it. They help us grieve without being destroyed by grief. They let us honor the dead and maintain connection to them, even as we acknowledge they're gone. In the absence of certain knowledge about what happens after death, myths provide working hypotheses that allow us to function, to find meaning even in loss. Think about myths of seasonal death and rebirth. Persephone descending to the underworld and returning. Osiris being killed and resurrected. The dying and rising gods that appear in various forms across many traditions. These myths don't just explain seasons or agricultural cycles, they're teaching something profound about the nature of existence. That death and life are interconnected. That what seems to end might return in a new form. That loss is temporary. That winter is followed by spring. These myths help people endure the deaths of loved ones, the death of communities, even their own approaching death, by suggesting that death is part of a larger cycle, not a final termination. As you lie here in the quiet darkness, maybe you can feel how these ideas work on a level deeper than rational thought. There's something soothing about the idea of cycles, of patterns that repeat, of connections that continue. It's not about believing literally in ancient gods or afterlife realms. It's about recognizing that myths speak to something in us that needs these larger patterns, these bigger stories. Let's think now about how myths shape morality and values. Every culture needs to teach its members how to behave, what's acceptable, what's admirable, what's shameful. You could do this with lists of rules, and many cultures do. But rules without context are easily forgotten or ignored. Myths embed those values in memorable stories, where you can see them in action and understand why they matter. Consider myths about hospitality. In many ancient cultures, hospitality wasn't just a nice custom, it was sacred. There are myths where gods or spirits disguise themselves as travelers to test people's hospitality. Those who welcome the stranger are blessed. Those who turn them away are punished. Why? Because in harsh, uncertain times, hospitality could mean the difference between life and death for travelers. A culture that values hospitality is a culture where travelers are safer, where trust between strangers is possible, where trade and cultural exchange can happen. The myths teach this value not by stating it as a rule, but by showing its importance through story. Or consider myths about hubris, excessive pride, and arrogance. Greek mythology is full of stories about people who become too proud, who challenge the gods, who think themselves above natural limits. And they're always punished for it. Icarus flies too close to the sun. Arachne challenges Athena to a weaving contest. Narcissus becomes obsessed with his own beauty. These stories teach humility not through preaching, but through cautionary tales that make the consequences of pride viscerally clear. But myths don't just teach through negative examples. They also provide positive ideals to aspire to. The wise king, the faithful friend, the devoted lover, the clever trickster who survives through wit, the warrior who fights with honor, the mother who sacrifices for her children, the teacher who passes on knowledge. These archetypal figures show us what the culture values, what kind of person you might want to become. And here's something sophisticated about how this works. Myths don't usually present perfect characters. Even the heroes are flawed. Even the gods make mistakes. Greek gods are jealous, petty, lustful, vengeful. Norse gods are sometimes foolish. Trickster figures are morally ambiguous. This isn't a failure of the myth makers, it's realism. Real people are complicated. We all contain both noble and ignoble impulses. We all make mistakes. By showing that even the gods and heroes are flawed, myths make morality more approachable. They're not demanding perfection. They're acknowledging that being human means being imperfect, while still striving to be better. This complexity also makes myths more interesting and more memorable. A perfectly good character is boring. A character who struggles with temptation, who makes mistakes and learns from them, who has to wrestle with difficult choices, that's compelling. That's human. And that makes the moral lessons more powerful because you can see yourself in the character. You can imagine facing the same choices. You can learn from their mistakes without having to make those mistakes yourself. Let's think about trickster figures for a moment, because they're fascinating examples of how myths can be morally complex. Tricksters appear in mythologies all over the world. Loki in Norse myths, Anansi in West African stories, coyote or raven in many indigenous American traditions, Hermes in Greek mythology. These characters lie, steal, break rules, cause chaos. Yet they're not villains. They're often beloved characters. Why? Because tricksters represent something important about survival and adaptation. They show that sometimes you can't win by following the rules, that cleverness and flexibility can be virtues, that questioning authority and established order can be necessary. Tricksters are often culture heroes who steal fire or bring important gifts to humanity. Their rule-breaking serves a larger purpose. They teach us that the world is complex, that rigid adherence to rules can be as problematic as ignoring them completely, that humor and cleverness have their place alongside strength and honor. Trickster stories also provide a safe way to express rebellion and criticism within a culture. Through these stories, people could laugh at authority, imagine breaking taboos, explore what happens when you challenge the established order. This is actually quite healthy for a culture. It provides a release valve for tension and resentment. It acknowledges that rules and authorities aren't perfect. It keeps the culture flexible rather than rigid. This gets at something important about myths in general. They're not propaganda. They're not simple indoctrination tools. Good myths are ambiguous. They contain tensions and contradictions. They allow for multiple interpretations. This is why they remain vital and interesting across centuries. If they were just straightforward moral lessons, they'd be boring, and they'd stop being told. But because they're complex, because they can be interpreted different ways, because they reward repeated attention and thought, they stay alive. Think about any myth you know well. The more you think about it, the more you find in it. It might seem simple on the surface, but there are layers underneath. Different people will emphasize different aspects of the same myth, depending on their interests and experiences. A psychologist might see one thing, a philosopher might see another. A parent might relate to one character. A child might identify with a different one. This flexibility is a feature, not a bug. It's what allows myths to speak to entire communities while still being personally meaningful to individuals. Now let's think about how myths relate to emotion. Stories are incredibly powerful tools for generating and shaping emotion. When you read a novel or watch a movie, you feel what the characters feel. Your heart races during action scenes. You cry at sad moments. You feel joy when things go well for characters you care about. This isn't just entertainment. This is your brain practicing emotions, rehearsing responses, building emotional intelligence. Myths do this too, but on a cultural scale. When everyone in a community knows the same myths, when they've all felt the same emotional responses to the same stories, they develop shared emotional templates. They know what it feels like, through story, to face great danger, to lose someone they love, to be betrayed, to triumph, to sacrifice for others. This shared emotional vocabulary helps people understand and empathize with each other. If you're going through grief and someone references a myth about grief, they're not just making an intellectual comparison. They're saying, I know this feeling. We've all encountered this feeling through story. You're not alone in it. Myths also help us understand and accept difficult emotions. When a myth shows a hero feeling fear or doubt, it validates those emotions. When it shows a character consumed by grief or anger and the consequences that follow, it teaches emotional regulation without preaching. When it shows love as both wonderful and dangerous, it acknowledges emotional complexity. Myths don't tell us to feel or not feel certain things. They show us emotions in context, help us understand where they come from and where they lead. There's something else myths do with emotion that's quite sophisticated. They create catharsis. This is a concept that comes from Greek drama, which was itself rooted in myth. Catharsis is the idea that experiencing powerful emotions through art can actually help purge or balance those emotions in yourself. Watching a tragedy, you feel fear and pity, and somehow that helps you process and release those emotions, rather than being consumed by them. It's like an emotional release valve. Ancient festivals often involved ritual reenactments of myths, dramatic performances where the community would collectively experience the emotional journey of the story. They'd feel the terror of chaos, the grief of loss, the joy of restoration. And then they'd go back to their regular lives, somehow cleansed or renewed by that collective emotional experience. Modern humans still do this. We go to movies, read books, play games that take us through intense emotional experiences. We're seeking that same cathartic effect, that same sense of feeling deeply and then returning to ourselves somehow changed. Myths also help us understand the emotions of life transitions. Birth, coming of age, marriage, parenthood, old age, death. These are all major transitions that involve complex emotions. Every culture has myths that deal with these transitions, stories that help people understand what they're going through. Coming-of-age myths are particularly common because every culture needs to help young people navigate that difficult transition from childhood to adulthood. These myths often involve leaving home, facing trials alone, encountering mentors or guides, undergoing some kind of test or ordeal, and returning transformed. This is exactly what adolescence feels like. You're leaving the safety of childhood. You're being tested by new challenges. You're trying to figure out who you are and what you're capable of. You need guidance, but you also need to prove yourself. Having myths that reflect this journey helps young people feel that what they're experiencing is normal, that others have been through it, that there's a pattern and a purpose to it. The same is true for other transitions. Myths about lovers separated by obstacles help people understand the pain and persistence of love. Myths about parents sacrificing for children help people accept the challenges of parenthood. Myths about aging heroes or wise elders help people navigate growing old. Myths about death and what comes after help people face mortality. At every stage of life, myths provide stories that reflect back what we're feeling and help us understand it. As you listen, maybe you're thinking about your own life transitions, moments when you changed, when something ended and something new began. Maybe you can recognize mythic patterns in your own experience. That's not you imposing false patterns on random events. That's you recognizing that human experiences have shapes, that they recur, that they're part of being alive. Myths help us see these patterns. Let's think now about imagination and how myths feed it. Imagination isn't just about fantasy and make-believe. It's one of our most important cognitive abilities. Imagination lets us envision things that don't exist yet. It lets us plan for the future, learn from the past, solve problems by mentally trying different solutions, empathize with others by imagining what they feel. Imagination is essential to being human. Myths are exercises for the imagination. They ask us to envision impossible things. Gods, monsters, magic, transformations, worlds different from our own. In doing this, they stretch our imaginative capacity. Children who hear myths and fairy tales are developing their ability to think symbolically, to understand that things can represent other things, that the world is more than just what appears on the surface. This is crucial for all kinds of later learning, including abstract thinking, mathematics, metaphor, and art. But myths don't just exercise imagination in children. They continue to feed adult imagination too. They provide images and symbols and stories that artists, writers, and creators have drawn on for thousands of years. How many paintings depict scenes from mythology? How many poems and plays and novels retell or reimagine mythic stories? How many composers have written music inspired by myths? The creative arts are saturated with mythology because myths provide such rich material. They're stories that have already proven their power, characters that already resonate, symbols that already carry meaning. And it's not just professional artists who benefit from this. Everyone who thinks creatively, who tries to solve problems in original ways, who imagines different possibilities, is using the same imaginative capacity that myths help develop. When you imagine how a conversation might go before having it, when you plan a project by envisioning the steps, when you consider different choices and their possible outcomes, you're using imagination. Myths trained humanity to think this way, to move beyond immediate, concrete reality into the realm of possibility. Myths also taught us to think symbolically about ourselves. The ability to see your life as a journey, to see yourself as playing certain roles at different times, to think about your personality as containing different aspects that might conflict or harmonize. These are all forms of symbolic thinking that myths encourage. Modern psychology has formalized some of this with concepts like the shadow self, or the inner child, or the different ego states. But myths were exploring this territory long before psychology existed as a discipline. Carl Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, was fascinated by myths. He believed that myths express universal patterns he called archetypes, fundamental images and story patterns that exist in what he called the collective unconscious. Whether you accept his theories or not, his basic insight was sound. Myths do seem to express patterns that recur across cultures and time periods. The hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the shadow. These figures appear in some form in mythologies around the world. This suggests they're tapping into something universal about human psychology and experience. Jung thought that engaging with myths, whether through studying them or through dreaming or through creative expression, helped individuals become more whole. By recognizing and integrating the different archetypal energies within yourself, by understanding your own psychological patterns through the mirror of myth, you could achieve what he called individuation, becoming more fully yourself. Again, whether you accept his specific framework or not, the basic idea that myths can help with psychological growth and self-understanding is sound. Many people do find that myths help them understand themselves better. This happens because myths externalize internal processes. They take psychological dynamics and make them into stories about characters and events. It's easier to understand a psychological pattern when you see it played out in a story than when you try to analyze it abstractly. For instance, understanding your own shadow side, the parts of yourself you don't want to acknowledge, becomes clearer when you see hero myths where the hero must confront a dark double or enemy, who often represents the hero's own repressed qualities. That's your shadow, externalized as a character you can observe and think about. The night has fully settled now, and perhaps you're sinking deeper into rest. This is perfect, because what we're talking about, the way myths work below the surface of conscious thought, the way they shape us through symbol and story and emotion, all of this happens most powerfully when we're in a receptive state, when our rational mind quiets and our deeper mind opens. This is the state between waking and sleeping, the state where dreams emerge, and it's the state where myths do their deepest work. We've been exploring how myths shape individual minds. But now, let's widen the lens and think about how myths shaped entire civilizations. Myths were not only personal or psychological tools, they formed the foundations of cultures. They were the organizing principles of societies, the frameworks through which people understood their place in the world and their relationships with one another. To see how deeply myths influence civilization, we need to consider what happens when humans move from small tribal groups into large, complex societies. In a small tribe where everyone knows one another, social cohesion develops naturally through personal relationships. You cooperate because you share blood, history, and daily life, and because your survival depends on maintaining harmony. But what happens when communities grow? When you live in a city with thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom you will never meet. How do you create trust and cooperation among strangers? This is one of the great challenges of civilization, and myths were essential in addressing it. Shared myths create shared identity. When you and a stranger know the same stories, honor the same gods, celebrate the same festivals, and follow customs rooted in a common mythology, you gain a basis for trust, even without personal familiarity. You belong to the same larger story. You share the same cultural world. That shared narrative makes large-scale cooperation possible in a way that personal bonds alone never could. Think of the great ancient cities: Athens, Rome, Babylon, Teotihuacan, Chang'an. These were vast, intricate societies with complex economies, sophisticated governments, monumental architecture, and flourishing arts and scholarship. What held them together? Yes, force and law played a role. But just as important were shared belief, shared story, shared myth. An Athenian was not simply someone who lived in Athens. To be Athenian meant living under the protection of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, born from the head of Zeus, who earned the city's patronage by gifting the olive tree. This wasn't only a story, it was identity. And that identity carried real consequences. In moments of crisis, Athenians could be called to defend their city, to sacrifice for the common good, not merely for themselves, but for something sacred, something bestowed by the gods. Myth transformed the city from a cluster of buildings into a living symbol. It gave it meaning, a purpose beyond individual interest. The same was true across civilizations. Egyptian culture was structured around myths of divine kingship, the belief that the pharaoh embodied or represented the gods, sustaining cosmic order. Rome grounded its identity in the myth of Aeneas, survivor of Troy, linking Roman destiny to ancient heroic lineage. Chinese dynasties invoked the mandate of heaven, a mythic religious principle that legitimized rule and moral authority. In every case, myth was not decoration, it was infrastructure, the narrative architecture that made large-scale organization and cooperation possible. But myths did more than unify societies. They also defined their boundaries. Your myths marked who you were, and by contrast, who you were not. Different peoples held different stories, honored different gods, and followed different customs rooted in distinct mythologies. At times, this produced conflict. Many wars have been driven by mythic and religious divisions. Yet, it also fostered cultural diversity, generating unique worldviews, artistic traditions, and social systems. The diversity of myth across human history is one of the reasons our global cultural tapestry is so rich, so varied, and so endlessly fascinating. As civilizations came into contact with each other through trade, conquest, or migration, something interesting happened with their myths. They didn't just clash. They also blended, evolved, influenced each other. Gods from one pantheon would be identified with gods from another. Stories would be borrowed and adapted. A Mesopotamian flood myth would appear in Hebrew scripture. Greek gods would take on characteristics of Egyptian ones. Roman gods would absorb Greek ones almost completely. Buddhist ideas would blend with local traditions as Buddhism spread through Asia. This mythological cross-pollination was one of the main ways that cultures influenced and learned from each other. Sometimes this blending happened peacefully through trade and cultural exchange. Merchants didn't just carry goods, they carried stories. Travelers would return home with tales of foreign gods and strange customs. Scribes would translate texts from other languages, introducing new ideas to their own cultures. This is how mythology evolved and grew richer over time, absorbing influences while maintaining distinct local character. Other times, the blending happened through conquest, and this was more complicated. When one civilization conquered another, what happened to the myths? Sometimes the conquerors tried to suppress the myths of the conquered people, seeing them as threats to their authority. But more often, there was a kind of negotiation. The conquered people's gods might be incorporated into the conqueror's pantheon, perhaps as lesser deities. Or the conquered people might maintain their own myths privately, while publicly conforming to the conqueror's religious practices. Or elements from both mythologies would merge into something new. This is actually how many of the mythological systems we know today came to exist. They're not pure original creations. They're the result of centuries of blending, borrowing, and evolution. Greek mythology itself was influenced by earlier Minoan and Mycenaean traditions, which were influenced by Middle Eastern traditions. Norse mythology shares roots with other Indo-European mythologies, but also absorbed elements from the cultures Vikings encountered. The rich tapestry of Hindu mythology developed over thousands of years, incorporating many different traditions and regional variations. Mythology is always a living, evolving thing, not a fixed set of stories. Let's think about what myths did for law and governance. How do you get people to follow rules and accept authority? One way is through force, but force alone is expensive and inefficient. It's much more effective if people believe the rules are legitimate, that they're not arbitrary, but have some higher justification. Myths provided that justification. If laws came from the gods, if kings ruled by divine right, if justice was a cosmic principle represented by divine figures, then following the law wasn't just about avoiding punishment. It was about maintaining the proper order of reality itself. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written law codes, begins with a prologue establishing that the gods chose Hammurabi to establish justice in the land. Egyptian law was said to embody Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order. In ancient Israel, the law was given directly by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. In each case, myth elevated law from mere human rules to sacred obligations. This made the law more powerful, more binding, more resistant to change or challenge. But there's a tension here, and it's worth thinking about. On one hand, connecting law to myth makes it stronger and more respected. On the other hand, it makes it harder to change or reform. If the law is divinely ordained, how can you question it or modify it when circumstances change? Different civilizations dealt with this tension in different ways. Some developed traditions of interpretation and reinterpretation, finding new meanings in old myths to justify new practices. Others allowed for the idea that divine will could be revealed progressively, that new prophets or revelations could update understanding. Others separated sacred and secular law to some degree, allowing the latter to be more flexible. This tension still exists today in societies where religious tradition influences law. It's one of the ongoing challenges of civilization, how to respect tradition and the wisdom it contains, while also allowing for growth, change, and response to new circumstances. Ancient civilizations were grappling with this same issue, and their mythologies reflect various attempts to balance continuity and change. Myths also shaped education in ancient civilizations. How did people learn to read and write? Often by copying and studying mythological texts. How did they learn values and proper behavior? Through myths taught from childhood. How did they learn history? Through mythological accounts that blended real events with legendary elaborations. In ancient Greece, Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were the foundation of education. Every educated person knew these texts intimately. They learned language, morality, history, and culture all from these mythological poems. This meant that myths shaped not just what people learned, but how they thought. The questions Homer explored: what makes a good leader? How should we face mortality? What do we owe to others? What is glory worth? These became the questions that Greek culture wrestled with for centuries. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were in dialogue with Homer, even when they criticized him. The myths set the terms of debate, provided the examples everyone knew, created a shared intellectual foundation. The same was true in other civilizations. In China, mythological and legendary accounts in texts like the records of the Grand Historian shaped how educated people thought about governance, morality, and history. In India, the great epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, served similar functions, teaching philosophy, ethics, and religious ideas through mythological narrative. In the Islamic world, stories of prophets and early Islamic history, while considered actual history by believers, functioned mythologically in shaping cultural values and identity. This educational function of myths had profound long-term effects. It meant that the values, assumptions, and ways of thinking embedded in ancient myths continued to influence cultures for centuries, even millennia. Even as societies changed, even as people stopped literally believing in the old gods, the myths continued to shape cultural consciousness. This is why we can still read ancient myths today and find them relevant. They shaped the cultures that shaped our own cultures. They're part of our inheritance, whether we realize it or not. Let's think about how myths shaped art and architecture. In ancient civilizations, most major art was mythological. Temples were built to honor gods. Statues depicted divine figures. Paintings and reliefs showed mythological scenes. Poetry and drama retold mythic stories. Music accompanied religious rituals. Art and myth were inseparable. If you wanted to create something beautiful and important, you created something related to the sacred stories of your culture. This wasn't limiting, it was liberating. Having a shared mythological vocabulary meant that artists could communicate complex ideas through images and symbols that everyone understood. A Greek seeing a statue of a woman with a helmet and owl would immediately know it was Athena and what she represented. An Egyptian seeing a figure with a jackal head knew it was Anubis and his role in the afterlife. This shared language allowed for sophisticated visual storytelling and symbolic communication. And artists didn't just passively illustrate myths. They interpreted them, emphasized different aspects, combined different elements, added new details. Each generation of artists found new possibilities in old stories. This kept the myths alive and relevant. A myth isn't a fixed text. It's a living tradition that exists in all its tellings and retellings, all its artistic representations, all the ways it's been understood and reimagined. Artists were keeping mythology vital by constantly renewing it. Architecture, too, was shaped by mythology. Temples weren't just buildings. They were cosmic symbols, earthly homes for gods, representations of mythological ideas. The layout of a temple might reflect the structure of the universe as understood in that culture's mythology. The decorations would tell mythic stories. The rituals performed there would reenact mythic events. A temple was mythology made solid, made physical, made into a space where humans could encounter the sacred. Even city planning could be influenced by mythology. Some cities were laid out according to cosmological principles derived from myths. The four directions might correspond to different elements or gods. The center might be marked by a sacred structure representing the axis mundi, the cosmic axis connecting heaven and earth. Roads might align with astronomical events that had mythological significance. The city itself became a kind of three-dimensional mandala, a sacred space organized according to mythic principles. This means that in ancient civilizations, people were surrounded by mythology. It wasn't something separate from daily life. It was embedded in the environment, in the stories they heard, in the art they saw, in the rituals they performed, in the festivals they celebrated, in the laws they followed, in the way their cities were organized. Mythology was the air they breathed, the water they swam in. It shaped their entire worldview. Now let's think about festivals and rituals, because these were where myths came alive in communal experience. Reading or hearing a myth is one thing. Participating in a ritual that enacts the myth is something else entirely. It's more visceral, more emotional, more transformative. Ancient civilizations were filled with festivals that brought communities together to collectively experience mythological stories. Consider the ancient Greek festival of Dionysia, held in honor of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and theater. This festival included dramatic performances of tragedies and comedies, most of which were based on myths. The entire community would gather to watch these plays over several days. They weren't just being entertained, they were collectively experiencing fundamental myths of their culture, grappling with deep questions about fate, justice, suffering, and the gods. It was a form of collective meaning-making, of cultural renewal. Or consider the Roman festival of Saturnalia, where normal social order was temporarily suspended. Slaves and masters would trade places. Gift-giving and feasting were obligatory. It was a time of chaos and reversal, rooted in myths about Saturn's golden age, when all people were equal. This festival served as a kind of pressure release valve for the society, allowing people to briefly experience a different order of things before returning to the normal hierarchy. It was also a reminder of mythological ideals of equality and abundance, even if those ideals weren't fully realized in daily life. Many ancient festivals involved processions, where sacred objects or statues of gods would be carried through the city. The entire community would participate, either in the procession or as witnesses. These weren't just parades, they were ritual reenactments of mythological journeys. The statue moving through the streets represented the god moving through the world. The community, by participating, was affirming their connection to the divine, their place in the cosmic order. Other festivals marked seasonal transitions and were rooted in agricultural myths. Planting and harvest times were occasions for rituals that reenacted myths of death and rebirth, of gods descending to the underworld and returning, of the eternal cycle of decay and renewal. These festivals helped communities mark time, anticipate the future, and feel connected to the natural rhythms that their survival depended on. What's important to understand is that these rituals weren't just symbolic. For the participants, they were real encounters with sacred reality. When you participated in a ritual reenacting a myth, you weren't just remembering a story, you were making it present, bringing its power into the here and now. This is hard for modern people to fully grasp, because we tend to think of the past as separate from the present, as something that happened once and is now over. But in mythological thinking, sacred events exist in a kind of eternal present. They happened once in mythic time, and they continue to be available through ritual reenactment. This concept of mythic time is actually quite sophisticated. It recognizes that there are different kinds of time. There's ordinary time, the time of daily life, one thing after another. And there's sacred time, the time of origins and eternally significant events. Rituals allow people to step out of ordinary time and into sacred time, to reconnect with the foundational events of their culture. This provides continuity, meaning, and renewal. It reminds people who they are and where they come from. As you listen in the quiet night, maybe you can sense something of what this must have felt like. To be part of a community all experiencing the same story, all participating in the same ritual, all feeling connected to the same sacred reality. It's a kind of collective experience that's rare in modern individualistic societies, but it was central to ancient life. And perhaps we miss it more than we realize. Let's think about priesthoods and religious specialists. As civilizations grew more complex, so did their religious practices. It wasn't enough anymore for everyone to know the myths casually. Specialists emerged who knew them deeply, who could interpret them, who could perform the proper rituals, who could mediate between the human and divine realms. Priests, priestesses, shamans, oracles. These figures had immense cultural power because they were the experts in mythology and ritual. This specialization had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it meant that myths were preserved carefully, that rituals were performed correctly, that there was institutional continuity. Priests would spend years learning mythology, memorizing texts, mastering ritual procedures. This ensured that knowledge wasn't lost, that traditions were maintained. The great temples became libraries and schools, as well as places of worship. They preserved not just religious knowledge, but also astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, all of which were intertwined with mythology in ancient civilizations. On the negative side, specialization could create hierarchy and exclusion. If only trained priests could access the deepest mysteries, that gave them power over others. Sometimes, this power was used wisely for the community's benefit. Other times, it was abused. Mystery religions in the ancient world often had different levels of initiation, with secret knowledge revealed only to those who had undergone proper preparation. This created insider and outsider status within religious communities. There was also the risk that religion could become overly complex and formalized, losing the vitality and directness it had in simpler times. When you need trained specialists to mediate between you and the gods, when rituals become elaborate productions requiring extensive preparation, religion can start to feel distant from ordinary life. This is one reason why reform movements and new religious impulses would periodically arise, trying to restore a more direct, personal connection to the sacred. But despite these complications, religious specialists played crucial roles in maintaining civilization. They were teachers, counselors, judges, healers, and keepers of knowledge. They helped people navigate life's challenges using the wisdom encoded in myths. When someone was sick, they might prescribe both practical remedies and ritual ones derived from mythological knowledge. When someone faced a difficult decision, they might consult oracles who would interpret the will of the gods. When communities faced crisis, priests would perform rituals to restore divine favor. The oracles deserve special mention because they're such a fascinating aspect of ancient religious practice. The oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece is the most famous, but many cultures had similar institutions. These were places where divine wisdom was believed to be accessible, where the gods would speak through specially prepared individuals. People would travel great distances to consult oracles about everything from personal matters to affairs of state. What's interesting is that oracular pronouncements were often ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. This wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Ambiguity allowed the oracle to be right, no matter what happened. But more than that, it forced the questioner to think deeply, to consider multiple possibilities, to take responsibility for their own interpretation and decisions. The oracle didn't make decisions for you. It helped you clarify your thinking, confront your assumptions, imagine different outcomes. In this way, consulting an oracle was a psychological and philosophical process as much as a religious one. This points to something important about how myths functioned in ancient civilizations. They weren't rigid dogmas that everyone had to accept without question. They were frameworks for thinking, tools for understanding, starting points for discussion and interpretation. There was often room for debate, for different schools of thought, for philosophical investigation of mythological ideas. Greek philosophers famously debated the nature of the gods, the meaning of myths, the relationship between divine and human realms. This intellectual ferment happened within the context of a mythologically based culture, not in opposition to it. As civilizations matured, philosophy often emerged as a way of thinking more abstractly about the same questions myths addressed. What is justice? What is the good life? What is reality? How should we live? Philosophers would take mythological ideas and subject them to logical analysis. Sometimes they'd criticize myths for being too anthropomorphic or morally problematic. But they couldn't escape the influence of myths on their thinking. The concepts they worked with, soul, virtue, cosmos, fate, were all shaped by mythological traditions. This relationship between myth and philosophy is complex and fascinating. Philosophy didn't replace myth. It grew out of myth and alongside myth, sometimes criticizing it, sometimes defending it, always in dialogue with it. Even Plato, who famously criticized poets and their myths, created his own philosophical myths, allegorical stories to convey ideas that couldn't be expressed purely logically. The myth of the cave, the myth of these are Plato's attempts to use mythic storytelling for philosophical purposes. What we see then is that myths were flexible enough to accommodate growing intellectual sophistication. As civilizations developed, as people became more educated and thoughtful, myths didn't have to be abandoned. They could be reinterpreted allegorized, philosophized, while still maintaining their power and relevance. This is one reason mythological traditions could last for so long, surviving changes in knowledge, politics, and social structure. The night deepens further, and perhaps your mind is moving in that space between thought and dream, where ideas flow more freely, where connections become visible that daylight thinking might miss. This is the right state for understanding how myths work at the level of civilization, how they create the invisible architecture that allows millions of people to cooperate, to share values, to feel part of something larger than themselves. Myths are the story a civilization tells itself about itself, and that story shapes everything the civilization does and becomes. As civilizations rose and fell, as empires expanded and collapsed, as centuries turned into millennia, something remarkable happened to myths. They didn't disappear. They transformed, adapted, traveled, and continued to shape human consciousness in new ways. To understand how ancient myths still affect us today, we need to think about this long journey from the ancient world to our modern one, and how stories that began around campfires thousands of years ago still echo in our minds. Let's start by thinking about what happened as the ancient world gradually gave way to new religious and philosophical movements. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and other major religions emerged and spread, often replacing or absorbing older mythological systems. You might think this would mean the death of ancient myths, but that's not what happened. Instead, there was a complex process of transformation and preservation. The old stories didn't vanish. They went underground, merged with new traditions, or continued in altered forms. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, for instance, it didn't simply erase Greek and Roman mythology. Many mythological elements were incorporated into Christian tradition. Pagan festivals were transformed into Christian holidays, often keeping the same dates and similar customs. Saints took on attributes and functions of older gods. Stories from classical mythology continued to be told, but now they were interpreted allegorically as prefiguring Christian truths or as moral lessons. The myths were Christianized rather than destroyed. This happened partly because educated people in medieval Europe still learned Latin and Greek by reading classical texts, including mythological ones. Virgil, Ovid, Homer, these poets were part of education even in monasteries. Monks copying manuscripts preserved mythological texts alongside Christian ones. So the stories survived, studied and transmitted, even in a culture that officially rejected pagan gods. The myths were too beautiful, too culturally important, too useful for teaching language and rhetoric to be discarded completely. Something similar happened in other parts of the world. As Buddhism spread from India through Asia, it encountered and absorbed local mythologies. Chinese Buddhism incorporated elements of Taoism and Chinese folk religion. Japanese Buddhism merged with Shinto. Tibetan Buddhism absorbed elements of the indigenous Bon tradition. The result wasn't pure replacement, but synthesis, new hybrid forms that maintained continuity with local mythological traditions while introducing new ideas. In the Islamic world, pre-Islamic Arabian mythology was officially rejected, but elements of it persisted in folklore and popular practice. Meanwhile, Islamic scholars preserved and transmitted Greek, philosophical and scientific texts, including commentaries on mythology. Stories from the Quran, which Muslims regard as revelation rather than myth, nonetheless function mythologically in shaping culture and consciousness. And, as Islam spread, it too encountered and sometimes absorbed elements of local traditions. What we see across all these transitions is that myths are remarkably resilient. They persist even when official belief systems change. They adapt to new contexts while maintaining recognizable patterns. This tells us something important. Myths aren't just religious doctrine that can be disproven or replaced. They're deeper than that. They're expressions of enduring human concerns, structured in ways that resonate with how our minds work. You can change religions, but the underlying psychological and social functions that myths serve remain necessary. Think about fairy tales and folklore. These are often degraded myths, ancient stories that have survived by becoming children's tales or peasant superstitions rather than high culture or official religion. A story about gods might become a story about kings or magical creatures. The sacred becomes the magical. The cosmic becomes the local. But the story structure, the character types, the symbolic elements, these often remain recognizable even after centuries of transformation. The Brothers Grimm, collecting German fairy tales in the 19th century, were actually preserving fragments of much older mythological traditions. Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Snow White, these aren't just entertaining stories. They're echoes of ancient myths about death and rebirth, about transformation and testing, about the journey from innocence to maturity. The fairy godmother is a diminished form of the wise goddess. The wicked stepmother carries traces of the terrible mother archetype. The prince who awakens the sleeping princess with a kiss is performing a ritual that once had sacred significance. This preservation of myths in folklore is important because it means ordinary people, not just educated elites, maintained connection to mythological patterns, even when they no longer knew the original myths. The village storyteller passing on folktales was doing the same work as the ancient bard, teaching values, explaining mysteries, providing models for living, all through symbolic narrative. The content had changed, but the function remained the same. During the Renaissance in Europe, there was a deliberate revival of interest in classical mythology. Scholars rediscovered and translated ancient texts that had been forgotten or inaccessible. Artists took mythological subjects as inspiration for paintings and sculptures. Poets retold and reimagined classical myths. This wasn't just nostalgia or academic interest. It was a recognition that these ancient stories contained wisdom, beauty, and psychological insight that remained valuable. Renaissance humanists saw in classical mythology a different way of thinking about humanity and nature than what medieval Christianity offered. The myths celebrated human achievement, physical beauty, worldly life, in ways that complemented and sometimes challenged religious otherworldliness. This wasn't necessarily anti-Christian. Many Renaissance thinkers tried to synthesize classical and Christian ideas, finding deeper meanings that transcended both traditions. But it did mean that mythological ways of thinking gained new vitality and influence. This Renaissance recovery of mythology had lasting effects. It established classical myths as a permanent part of Western cultural literacy. Even people who never read the original texts would encounter mythological references in art, literature, and education. Knowing Greek and Roman mythology became part of being educated. This meant that mythological patterns, symbols, and stories continued to shape how Western culture thought about human nature, society, and the cosmos. But something interesting happened as European culture moved into the Enlightenment and modern period. As science advanced, as rational empirical thinking became dominant, the literal truth of myths became increasingly hard to defend. No educated person could still believe that Zeus actually threw thunderbolts or that the sun was a god driving a chariot across the sky. Did this mean myths became irrelevant? Not at all. Instead, new ways of understanding myths emerged. Myths came to be seen not as failed science, but as something else entirely, as poetry, as symbol, as expressions of human psychology and culture. This was actually a kind of liberation for myths. They didn't have to be literally true to be important. They could be true in other ways: psychologically true, artistically true, symbolically true. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and 19th centuries embraced mythology with new enthusiasm. Romantic poets and artists saw myths as expressions of imagination and emotion, as alternatives to cold Enlightenment rationalism. They created new myths, new symbolic systems, drawing on traditional mythology but adapting it to modern sensibilities. William Blake created an entire personal mythology. The German Romantics revived interest in Norse and Germanic mythology. Poets like Keats and Shelley reimagined classical myths for their own purposes. This romantic engagement with mythology wasn't just aesthetic. It was philosophical and psychological. Romantics intuited that myths expressed something essential about human nature that couldn't be reduced to rational propositions. They recognized that imagination, symbol, and narrative were fundamental to how we understand ourselves and the world. In pushing back against pure rationalism, they were asserting the ongoing relevance of mythological ways of thinking. As we moved into the 20th century, new fields of study emerged that took myths seriously in new ways. Anthropology studied myths cross-culturally, identifying patterns and functions. Psychology, especially Jungian psychology, explored myths as expressions of the unconscious mind. Comparative religion examined mythological themes across different traditions. Literary criticism analyzed how mythological structures underlie modern narratives. These academic disciplines validated what artists and poets had intuited, that myths aren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated expressions of universal human concerns. This brings us to something crucial for understanding how ancient myths still shape our minds today. The structures and patterns of myths, the archetypes, the narrative forms, the symbolic vocabulary. These have been absorbed so deeply into culture that we use them constantly without realizing it. They're part of the infrastructure of how we think and communicate. When we call someone a narcissist, or say they have a Midas touch, or describe a journey as an odyssey, we're using mythological shorthand. But it goes much deeper than just vocabulary. The stories we tell ourselves, both culturally and personally, follow mythological patterns because those patterns work. They resonate with something fundamental about human experience. When Hollywood makes a blockbuster movie, it almost always follows some version of the hero's journey, because that structure has proven itself over thousands of years. The details change. The hero might be a space pilot instead of a Greek warrior. The monster might be an alien instead of a dragon. But the pattern remains recognizable because it's deeply embedded in our narrative expectations. Think about how we structure our personal narratives, the stories we tell about our own lives. We don't just list events chronologically. We create narratives with themes, turning points, character development. We identify challenges we've overcome, lessons we've learned, ways we've grown. We cast other people in our stories as mentors, allies, or obstacles. We look for meaning in our experiences, for patterns and purposes. All of this is mythological thinking. We're treating our lives as stories, with ourselves as the protagonists, and we're drawing on mythological templates whether we realize it or not. This is why memoirs and autobiographies often feel unsatisfying if they're just factual recitations of events. We need narrative shaping. We need the events to add up to something, to reveal character, to demonstrate change or growth or understanding. We need our lives to make sense as stories. And the shapes that make sense to us, the narrative arcs that feel satisfying and meaningful, these are inherited from mythology. They're patterns that have been told and retold for thousands of years, proving themselves generation after generation. Modern psychology has given us new vocabulary for understanding this. We talk about narrative identity, the stories we construct about who we are. We talk about meaning-making, the process of interpreting our experiences to create coherence and purpose. We recognize that mental health partly depends on having a coherent life story, on being able to integrate experiences into a meaningful narrative. When trauma or crisis disrupts our narrative, when events don't fit our story about ourselves, psychological distress follows. Therapy often involves reconstructing narrative, finding new ways to understand and integrate difficult experiences. All of this is continuous with what myths have always done. They've provided templates for meaning-making, for integrating experience into coherent story, for understanding suffering and change. Modern psychology has formalized and medicalized some of this, but the underlying process is ancient. We're still doing what humans have always done, using narrative and symbol to make sense of existence. Let's think about how myths continue to operate in modern society. At a collective level, not just individually. Nations still have founding myths, stories about their origins and identity that may be historically questionable, but are psychologically and culturally powerful. American mythology includes stories about pilgrims seeking freedom, founding fathers establishing democracy, pioneers conquering the frontier. These stories shape national identity and values, whether they're historically accurate or not. They're modern myths, serving the same functions that ancient creation myths did. Political movements often use mythological language and imagery. Leaders present themselves as heroes, fighting monsters of corruption or tyranny. Social problems are framed in mythological terms, as battles between good and evil, as quests for justice, as struggles for liberation. This isn't cynical manipulation, at least not entirely. It's recognition that mythological narratives are persuasive and mobilizing. They help people make sense of complex political realities by fitting them into familiar story structures. Even science, which ostensibly replaced mythology, sometimes takes on mythological dimensions. Popular science often presents scientific progress as a heroic quest, with scientists as heroes, overcoming ignorance and superstition. The story of evolution becomes a grand narrative about humanity's origins. Space exploration is framed as a new frontier, a contemporary version of ancient voyage myths. These scientific narratives are factually based in ways myths weren't, but they're structured mythologically to give them meaning and emotional resonance. Dwindling console is modern advertising constantly draws on heroic imagery, promises of transformation, and appeals to identity and belonging. Products are not only presented for what they do, but for what they symbolize. For the story they allow you to tell about yourself. Driving a certain car, wearing a certain style of clothing, adopting a particular lifestyle, these become ways of expressing identity, of placing yourself inside a larger cultural narrative. This works because we are meaning-seeking beings who think symbolically, the very way myths first taught us to think. Entertainment is perhaps the clearest continuation of mythic tradition. Films, television, video games, novels, comics, all of them tell stories that lean heavily on mythological structures. Superhero stories function as modern mythology. Godlike figures in bright colors fighting symbolic battles. Fantasy and science fiction borrow openly from myth, retelling ancient narratives in new settings or creating new worlds that follow familiar archetypal patterns. Even realistic dramas often carry mythic bones beneath the surface. Ancient character types and timeless conflicts dressed in modern clothing. What's striking is that the stories that endure, the ones that resonate most deeply, are usually those most closely aligned with mythic structure. Star Wars is, at its core, the hero's journey in space. The Lord of the Rings is steeped in Norse and Celtic myth. Harry Potter follows mythic coming-of-age patterns. The Matrix weaves together messianic mythology and philosophical allegory. These stories move us because they echo patterns that myth has already planted in our collective imagination. Audiences recognize these patterns instinctively. You don't need to study mythology to feel that Luke Skywalker's journey follows something ancient. The shapes of the story feel right at a level beneath language. The mentor, the descent, the confrontation with darkness, the return transformed. We recognize them without needing to explain them. Myth has trained us to respond to these forms. In this way, ancient myths are still shaping consciousness today. Not only through reading old texts, though that happens, but through endless retellings and reinterpretations. Each time someone watches a story of sacrifice, transformation, or redemption, mythological structures are reinforced. The details change, but the deep architecture remains. There is something comforting and also a little unsettling about this. Comforting because it reveals a deep continuity in human nature. We are still, in many ways, the same storytelling beings who once sat beside fires beneath ancient skies. Our technologies have transformed, but our emotional needs, our search for meaning, our narrative instincts, these remain remarkably constant. There is steadiness in that continuity. But it can also feel unsettling because it suggests limits to originality. Are we truly creating our own stories, or are we unwittingly repeating ancient dramas? When we feel most individual, are we sometimes reenacting mythic roles that existed long before us? There is a tension here between universal patterns and personal uniqueness. Perhaps both truths coexist. Each of us is singular. No one else has lived your exact life or carries your precise perspective. And yet, we also participate in shared archetypal forms, inheritors of mythic traditions that shape how we think, feel, and narrate our lives. These are not opposites, they complement one another. Myths help us see ourselves as both unique individuals and participants in something timeless. As you rest here in the quiet of the night, you might feel that dual nature. You are yourself, specific, present, here in this moment. But you are also part of something older and larger. Your hopes, fears, questions, and struggles belong to you, and at the same time, they echo countless other human lives across history. Myths allow us to hold both truths gently at once. Now let's think about how myths help us face modern challenges. We live in a world profoundly different from the ancient one, with technologies our ancestors could never have imagined, and problems that are entirely new. Environmental crises, nuclear risk, artificial intelligence. Do ancient myths still have anything meaningful to say? The answer is yes, though not by offering technical solutions. Myths cannot tell us how to regulate technology or calculate emission targets. But they help us think about these issues at a deeper level, revealing the moral, emotional, and psychological dimensions that no technical model can address. Every technological problem is also a human one, shaped by values, fears, ambitions, and responsibility. Myth helps us navigate those deeper layers. Consider myths of hubris, stories of human overreach and its consequences. The story of Icarus is not about flight mechanics. It is about arrogance, about ignoring limits, about being intoxicated by our own brilliance. These themes speak powerfully to how we develop and wield modern technologies. Are we acting with wisdom or flying too close to the sun. Myths about humanity's relationship with nature also resonate strongly today. Many indigenous traditions emphasize interconnectedness, the idea that humans exist within nature, not above it. These stories carry lessons about reverence, restraint, and responsibility, perspectives that industrial civilization urgently needs. They do not replace scientific solutions, but they guide how we approach them. Myths about community and obligation speak to social and economic challenges as well. They raise questions about justice, inequality, power, and compassion. What do we owe one another? How do we balance individual freedom with collective well-being? Myths have explored these questions for millennia, offering wisdom, caution, and perspective. The value of myth is not that it hands us ready-made answers, but that it preserves human insight in memorable form. It reminds us that human nature has not changed as rapidly as our circumstances. The same hopes and fears that shaped ancient lives are still alive within us. Modern life can sometimes feel fragmented and hollow, flooded with stimulation, yet lacking coherence or meaning. Many people feel disconnected from nature, community, and tradition, encouraged to see themselves as isolated individuals chasing personal fulfillment through consumption. That can create a quiet emptiness. Myths offer a counterweight, a way back into deeper connection. Engaging with myth, whether ancient or modern, draws us into the long human story. It reminds us that our questions are old questions, that wisdom is carried forward across generations, that meaning is something we build together. You don't need literal belief in ancient gods to receive what myths offer, only a willingness to recognize the human truths they express. Many people today seek meaning in places outside traditional religion, through art, nature, activism, or new spiritual practices. Often, without realizing it, they are seeking what myth has always provided: connection, orientation, purpose, a language for suffering and renewal. That is why mythology continues to fascinate. Retellings attract eager audiences, courses and books about myth thrive. People are drawn, sometimes quietly, toward the deep stories that have sustained humanity for thousands of years. And you don't need to be a scholar to benefit from them. Mythic patterns already live within you, absorbed through culture, stories, films, and the narrative forms that surround daily life. What can help is becoming just a little more aware of them, noticing when they appear, reflecting on what they might be saying, and how they shape your experience. That is what we've been doing here tonight, gently bringing into awareness something that usually works in the background. And with that awareness comes a kind of freedom. When you recognize the patterns shaping your thoughts, you can meet them with intention. You can choose which stories to inhabit and which to let go. The night is deep now, that quiet threshold between late evening and morning, where the world feels still and mysterious. It is a fitting place to think about myth, a space between waking and dreaming, between the personal and the universal. And here, in this soft, liminal darkness, we can feel how ancient stories still move within us, guiding, echoing, and accompanying us through the enduring mystery of being human. We've traveled a long way together through the landscape of mythology, from ancient campfires to modern consciousness, from the birth of stories to their persistence across millennia. Now, as we approach the end of our journey, let's think about something deeply personal and immediate. How do myths shape your own mind, your own life, right now? And what does it mean to live consciously with mythology in a world that claims to have moved beyond it? There's a paradox at the heart of modern existence. We live in the most technologically advanced, scientifically informed era in human history. We understand the universe in ways ancient peoples couldn't imagine. We've split the atom, mapped the genome, explored distant planets, connected the entire world through digital networks. We have explanations for things that once seemed utterly mysterious. Lightning isn't Zeus's anger, it's electricity. The sun isn't a god, it's a star burning through nuclear fusion. Disease isn't demonic, possession. It's bacteria and viruses and genetic disorders. We know so much, and yet, knowing all this hasn't made us fundamentally different creatures. We still fall in love and have our hearts broken. We still fear death and seek meaning. We still struggle with anger, jealousy, ambition, and doubt. We still need stories to make sense of our lives. We still create heroes and villains, us and them. We still mark transitions with ritual, celebrate with festivals, mourn with ceremony. Strip away the technology and the scientific knowledge, and we're remarkably similar to our ancient ancestors. We're still humans, with human hearts and minds, facing human questions. This is why myths still shape us, not because we're ignorant or primitive, but because myths address aspects of existence that knowledge alone can't resolve. They address meaning, value, purpose, identity, all the things that make life worth living, but can't be measured or quantified. Science can tell you how things work, but it can't tell you how to live, what to care about, who to be. For that, you need stories, symbols, frameworks for meaning. You need myth. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people in modern societies don't consciously engage with traditional mythology. They're not studying Greek myths or performing ancient rituals. They're living ordinary lives, going to work, raising families, pursuing goals, dealing with problems. Yet mythological patterns are operating in their lives constantly, usually without awareness. The question is, what happens when you become aware of these patterns? How does conscious engagement with mythology change your experience? Let's think about personal identity first, because this is where mythology operates most intimately. Who are you? This seems like a simple question, but it's actually enormously complex. You're not just a name and a body and a collection of facts. You're a story you tell yourself about yourself. You have a narrative identity, sense of your history, your character, your journey, your purpose. And this narrative is shaped by mythological patterns, whether you realize it or not. Think about how you explain yourself to others. You probably don't just list biographical data. You tell stories. You highlight certain experiences and downplay others. You emphasize turning points, challenges overcome, lessons learned. You present yourself as having certain qualities, as being on a certain journey, as moving towards certain goals. All of this is narrative construction, and the structures you use are mythological. You might describe yourself as a survivor, a seeker, a builder, a rebel, a caretaker. These are archetypal roles drawn from thousands of years of storytelling. The interesting thing is that these narratives aren't just descriptions of who you are. They're partly creative acts. They shape who you become. When you consistently tell a certain story about yourself, you start to embody that story. If you see yourself as a victim, you'll interpret events through that lens and act accordingly. If you see yourself as a hero on a journey, you'll approach challenges differently. The story doesn't just reflect reality, it creates reality. This is where conscious engagement with mythology becomes powerful. If you're aware that you're constructing a narrative, that you're choosing how to interpret and tell your story, you gain agency. You can recognize when you're stuck in a limiting story and consciously reframe it. You can identify mythological patterns in your life and decide how to work with them. You can draw on mythological wisdom to navigate challenges. For instance, let's say you're going through a difficult transition. Maybe you've lost a job, or a relationship has ended, or you're facing illness, or you're simply feeling lost and uncertain about direction. This is painful, disorienting, frightening. But if you can recognize this as a version of the mythological pattern of descent into the underworld, it changes your relationship to the experience. You can see it as a necessary part of transformation rather than just random misfortune. In countless myths, the hero must descend into darkness before emerging renewed. Persephone must spend time in Hades. Inanna descends to the underworld and is stripped of everything. The shaman undergoes a symbolic death and dismemberment. Jesus spends 3 days in the tomb. These aren't just ancient stories. They're templates for understanding psychological and spiritual death and rebirth. When you go through such periods, when you feel like everything is falling apart, you're in the underworld. And the myths tell you this is part of the journey, that you will emerge, that this darkness has purpose. This doesn't make the pain less real, but it makes it meaningful rather than meaningless. It connects your personal suffering to a universal pattern, which can be oddly comforting. You're not alone in this. Others have been here. Story suggests there's a way through, even if you can't see it yet. This is the psychological power of myth, transforming chaos into cosmos, random suffering into meaningful trial. Or consider the hero's journey as a framework for understanding your life. You start in an ordinary world, the familiar but limiting situation you've known. A call to adventure disrupts this, whether through external events or internal restlessness. You might refuse the call initially, afraid or uncertain. But eventually, you cross a threshold into the unknown, leaving behind what's comfortable. You face trials and challenges, encounter allies and enemies, confront your deepest fears. At some point, you undergo a death and rebirth, a fundamental transformation. And finally, you return to the ordinary world, changed, carrying back something valuable to share. Now, this pattern doesn't literally happen in a neat sequence. Life is messier than that, but you can often recognize these elements in your experience, especially when you look back at significant life periods. That time you moved to a new city, that relationship that transformed you, that career change, that period of crisis that forced you to grow. These can all be understood through the lens of the hero's journey, and doing so helps you make sense of them, see patterns and meaning that weren't apparent while you were in the midst of things. The power of this framework is that it normalizes struggle. The hero doesn't succeed because everything goes smoothly. The hero succeeds by facing and overcoming difficulty. Obstacles aren't failures, they're necessary parts of the journey. This reframing can be incredibly helpful when you're going through hard times. You're not failing, you're in the trials phase. The challenges you're facing are making you stronger, teaching you something, preparing you for what comes next. But it's important not to be rigid about this. Mythological patterns are guides, not prescriptions. Your life doesn't have to follow any particular pattern, and sometimes the most helpful thing is to recognize when you're trying to force yourself into a story that doesn't fit. Maybe you don't need to be a hero right now. Maybe you need to rest, to tend your garden, to simply be, rather than constantly questing. Mythology offers many different patterns, many different roles. The wise elder, the trickster, the artist, the healer, the lover. You can draw on whichever patterns serve you in a given moment. Let's think about relationships and how mythology illuminates them. Every relationship has a mythological dimension, an archetypal quality that coexists with its unique personal reality. A parent isn't just an individual person. They also carry the archetype of parent, with all the accumulated associations and expectations that come with it. A lover carries the archetype of lover. A friend, a teacher, a rival. All of these have archetypal dimensions that shape how we experience and respond to them. This can be helpful for understanding relationship dynamics. When you have conflict with someone, it's not always about the specific individuals or situations. Sometimes you're enacting archetypal conflicts that humans have been working through for thousands of years. The tension between parent and child as the child seeks independence. The rivalry between siblings. The betrayal by a trusted friend. The complications of romantic love when desire and genuine connection don't align perfectly. Myths explore all of these patterns, showing us that what feels personally painful is also universally human. There's also the phenomenon of projection, where we unconsciously project archetypal qualities onto others. You might idealize someone as a perfect lover or mentor, seeing them not as they actually are, but as an embodiment of an archetype. This is exciting initially, but inevitably leads to disappointment when the real person fails to live up to the archetypal ideal. Understanding this mythological dimension of relationship can help you see people more clearly, appreciating their real qualities rather than projecting archetypal fantasies onto them. At the same time, recognizing archetypal patterns in relationships doesn't reduce them to clichés. Your mother isn't just the mother archetype. She's a unique individual whose relationship with you has its own specific texture and history. But understanding the archetypal dimension adds depth. It helps you see that some of what you're working through with your mother is part of the eternal mother-child dance that humans have always navigated. This can create compassion and perspective. Let's think about work and purpose, because this is an area where many modern people struggle with meaning. In traditional societies, your role and purpose were largely determined by birth and custom. You did what your family did, what your community needed, what tradition dictated. This could be limiting, but it also provided clarity and meaning. You knew your place in the larger story. You were contributing to something beyond yourself. Modern life offers far more freedom to choose your path, but with that freedom comes uncertainty and anxiety. What should you do with your life? What career should you pursue? How do you find work that's meaningful and not just a way to pay bills? These aren't just practical questions. They're existential questions about purpose and identity. And mythology can help you think about them more deeply. Many myths involve finding and fulfilling a vocation, a calling. The hero discovers their particular gift or destiny and learns to embody it fully. This isn't usually easy. There are often trials and doubts, but the pattern suggests that each person has something unique to contribute, some particular way of being in the world that's theirs to discover and express. This is more than just a career. It's about aligning who you are with what you do, finding work that expresses your deepest values and capacities. Of course, practical reality doesn't always allow for this. Most people have to work jobs that pay the bills rather than fulfilling their souls. But even here, mythological thinking can help. Work doesn't have to be your entire identity or sole source of meaning. You can find purpose in relationships, in creative pursuits, in community involvement, in how you show up in the world, regardless of what job you hold. The meaning is in how you live, not just what you do for money. Mythology also offers perspectives on success and failure that differ from contemporary culture's obsession with achievement. Many modern myths, the self-made success story, the overnight sensation, the genius inventor, create unrealistic expectations and often leave people feeling inadequate. Traditional mythology is actually more nuanced. Heroes fail frequently. They make mistakes, suffer defeats, struggle with limitations. Success often comes through persistence, help from others, and learning from failure rather than through solo brilliance. There are also myths that celebrate wisdom over achievement, being over doing, acceptance over striving. Not every story is about conquering and winning. Some are about understanding, about coming to terms with reality, about finding peace. These alternative patterns can be valuable correctives to the relentless achievement orientation of modern culture. Maybe success isn't about climbing to the top. Maybe it's about living authentically, treating others well, creating beauty, seeking truth, finding contentment. Let's think about suffering, because this is perhaps where mythology is most needed and most helpful. Everyone suffers. Loss, illness, disappointment, grief, fear, pain. These are inescapable parts of human existence. Modern culture often tries to deny or avoid this reality, promising solutions and happiness and perfect lives. But mythology is more honest. It acknowledges that suffering is intrinsic to existence, and it helps us think about how to bear it, how to find meaning in it, how to grow through it. Many myths involve suffering that seems meaningless, at least initially. Job loses everything and doesn't know why. Oedipus suffers a terrible fate despite trying to avoid it. The Buddha recognizes that life inherently involves suffering. These stories don't offer easy answers or simple solutions. But they do offer something valuable: acknowledgement that suffering is real and universal, and suggestions for how to meet it with dignity, wisdom, and sometimes even growth. The pattern of death and rebirth, which appears in so many myths, is fundamentally about suffering and transformation. Something must die for something new to be born. The old self must be released for the new self to emerge. This doesn't mean suffering is good or that we should seek it out. But it suggests that when suffering comes, as it inevitably does, it can be a doorway to transformation if we're willing to move through it, rather than just being destroyed by it. This is where ritual can help, even for modern people who don't follow traditional religious practices. Ritual marks transitions, honors losses, creates containers for intense emotion. When someone dies, we hold funerals, not just for practical reasons, but because we need ritual to help us process grief, to mark the transition, to begin healing. When someone marries, we hold ceremonies because the transition into partnership deserves to be marked and witnessed. Mythology provides the symbolic frameworks that make these rituals meaningful. You can create personal rituals too, drawing on mythological understanding, even if you're not following traditional forms. If you're going through a major transition, you might create a ritual to mark it, letting go of something that once defined you, crossing a threshold into a new phase of life, honoring what was while opening to what comes next. The specific form matters less than the intention and consciousness. You're engaging with the mythological dimension of existence, recognizing that your personal experience is part of larger patterns. As you lie here in the deep quiet of night, maybe you're thinking about your own life, your own story. Maybe you're recognizing patterns you hadn't seen before. Maybe you're finding new ways to understand experiences that once seemed random or meaningless. This is what mythology offers. Not answers exactly, but frameworks for meaning, perspectives that help experience cohere into story, connections between your small life and the large patterns of human existence across time. Let's think about death specifically, because this is the ultimate mystery that mythology addresses and that modern culture often avoids. We know more about the biological process of dying than any previous generation, but we're often less prepared for it psychologically and spiritually. We hide death away, medicalize it, deny it as long as possible. But mythology keeps death present, reminds us constantly that we're mortal, that life is precious because it ends, that how we face death matters. Different mythological traditions offer different perspectives on death, but most agree on certain things. Death is inevitable and universal. It's not punishment or failure. It's part of the natural order. How we live matters partly because we die. Death gives urgency and weight to our choices. And some kind of continuity exists, whether through literal afterlife beliefs, or through memory and legacy, or through the cycles of nature, or through the eternal patterns we participate in while alive. Modern people often live as if death isn't real, at least not for them, not yet, not soon. We can go days or weeks barely thinking about mortality. But mythology suggests this is actually an impoverished way to live. Keeping death present, not morbidly but honestly, can help us live more fully, more consciously, with greater appreciation for each moment. Memento, mori, remember you will die, isn't meant to depress you. It's meant to wake you up. There's a beautiful paradox here. By accepting mortality, by facing death consciously, we become more alive. We waste less time on things that don't matter. We're more present with people we love. We're more willing to take meaningful risks. We appreciate beauty more keenly. We find courage to live authentically rather than hiding behind facades. Death, properly understood through mythological wisdom, becomes not an enemy but a teacher. This doesn't mean losing the fear of death. That fear is natural and appropriate. But it means not being paralyzed by it, not letting it prevent you from living fully. The hero myths show us this. The hero is afraid but acts anyway. The hero knows death is possible, even likely, but undertakes the journey regardless, because something matters more than safety. This is the courage mythology teaches. Not fearlessness, but the willingness to live and act despite fear. To embrace life fully, even knowing it ends. As we approach the end of our time together, let's think about what it means to live consciously with mythology in the modern world. It doesn't mean rejecting science or reason or modernity. It doesn't mean believing literally in ancient gods or trying to recreate ancient ways of life. Those times are gone, and we are different people facing different challenges. But it does mean recognizing that mythology addresses dimensions of existence that remain relevant, that the wisdom encoded in ancient stories can still guide us, that the patterns and symbols and narratives that sustained humanity for thousands of years haven't become obsolete. Living consciously with mythology means paying attention to the stories you tell yourself and participate in. It means recognizing archetypal patterns in your experience and considering what they might be teaching you. It means drawing on mythological wisdom when facing challenges, transitions, or mysteries. It means creating meaning rather than just consuming entertainment. It means connecting your personal story to larger, timeless stories. It means seeing yourself as part of the long human journey, inheriting wisdom from ancestors while creating something new to pass on. It also means being selective and critical. Not all mythological patterns are equally helpful. Some are limiting or even harmful. Myths have been used to justify oppression, violence, and rigid hierarchies. The fact that something is ancient or traditional doesn't make it good. You get to choose which patterns to embrace and which to release. This is the freedom and responsibility of conscious engagement with mythology. You're not bound by tradition, but you can learn from it, taking what serves life and growth while letting go of what doesn't. What mythology ultimately offers is perspective. It reminds us that our concerns, though deeply personal, are also universal and timeless. Humans have always faced uncertainty, loss, change, fear. They've always sought meaning, connection, purpose. They've always loved and grieved and hoped and struggled. We're not alone in this. We're part of an ancient pattern, and there's comfort and wisdom in that recognition. Our specific circumstances change, but the fundamental human situation remains recognizable across millennia. The stories we've been thinking about tonight, the myths of heroes and gods and monsters, of death and rebirth, of journeys and transformations, these aren't relics of a primitive past. They're expressions of eternal aspects of human experience. They live in us still, shaping our dreams and fears and hopes, guiding how we understand ourselves and our world. And by becoming conscious of this mythological dimension of existence, by engaging with it thoughtfully and creatively, we can live with greater depth, meaning, and connection to the long human story we're all part of. The night is very deep now, approaching that darkest hour before dawn. Your breathing has probably slowed to its deepest rhythm. Your mind might be drifting between waking and sleeping, between thought and dream. This is perfect because this threshold state is where mythology lives most naturally, in that space between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the personal and universal, between time and eternity. Here, in this quiet darkness, you can feel the truth of what we've been exploring, the way ancient patterns still pulse through modern minds, still shape how we dream and fear and hope and love. And so we come to the quietest part of the night, that stillness before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath. We've traveled together through thousands of years of human story, from the first myths told around ancient fires to the ways these same patterns echo in our lives today. Now, in these final moments, let's simply rest in what we've discovered, letting it settle into something deeper than thought, something closer to understanding. There's a gentleness in recognizing how connected we are to all the humans who came before us. Every person who ever lived faced the same fundamental questions you face. They looked at the night sky and wondered. They loved people they would eventually lose. They felt joy and sorrow, confidence and doubt. They tried to make sense of existence, to find purpose in their days, to leave something meaningful behind. And they told stories to help them do all of this. Stories that were passed down and transformed but never lost. Stories that somehow made their way to you. When you think about your own life, your own struggles and triumphs and ordinary moments, you're thinking thoughts that have been thought countless times before. This isn't diminishing, it's actually quite beautiful. You're participating in something ancient and ongoing. The particular details of your life are unique to you, unrepeatable, yours alone. But the essence of what you experience, the love and loss, the fear and courage, the searching for meaning, this is the human experience that mythology has always addressed. Consider how remarkable it is that a story told 3,000 years ago can still move you today. That you can read about Odysseus trying to return home after years of wandering, facing obstacle after obstacle, losing companions, struggling against forces beyond his control, and feel something resonate in your own heart. You've never fought sea monsters or angered gods, but you know what it feels like to be far from home, to face difficulties, to wonder if you'll ever reach where you're trying to go. The myth speaks across the centuries because the human heart hasn't changed. Or think about fairy tales you heard as a child, Stories about transformation and testing, about good and evil, about courage and kindness rewarded. You probably didn't analyze these stories, you simply absorbed them, took them in at a level deeper than conscious thought, and they shaped you. They gave you templates for understanding the world, symbols for processing experience, hope that good might triumph over difficulty. Those stories are still in you, still influencing how you think and feel and interpret what happens to you. This is the quiet magic of mythology. It works beneath the surface, shaping consciousness in ways we rarely notice. The symbols sink into dreams, the patterns structure how we narrate experience, the archetypes influence how we see ourselves and others, and all of this happens naturally, organically, without effort or force. Myths don't impose themselves through argument or doctrine. They simply resonate with something deep in human nature, and that resonance does the work. What we've been doing here tonight is bringing some of this unconscious process into consciousness, not to control or manipulate it, but simply to appreciate it, to see it more clearly. And in seeing it, you gain a kind of friendship with these ancient patterns. You recognize them as companions on your journey, rather than invisible forces controlling you. You can work with them more consciously, draw on them more intentionally, while still allowing them to work their subtle magic below the surface of awareness. Think about how myths help us hold paradoxes that reason alone struggles with. Life and death aren't opposites, but partners in an endless dance. Strength and vulnerability aren't contradictions, but two faces of wholeness. The individual and the collective, the unique and the universal, the temporal and the eternal. These apparent opposites are actually complementary. Myths show us this through stories where heroes must die to be reborn, where loss leads to discovery, where descent precedes ascent. The stories don't explain these paradoxes logically. They simply embody them, make them felt, help us live with mystery rather than demanding resolution. Modern life often pushes us toward either-or thinking. You're either successful or unsuccessful, either right or wrong, either winning or losing. But mythology is more generous and more realistic. It makes space for both and, for complexity and ambiguity. The hero is both brave and afraid. The trickster is both helpful and harmful. The journey is both outward and inward. Life is both beautiful and terrible. Myths help us hold these tensions without needing to collapse them into simplistic certainty. This is deeply restful, actually. When you can hold paradox, when you can accept that things are complex and contradictory, and that's okay, you can stop struggling so hard for perfect understanding or control. You can let life be what it is, messy and mysterious and meaningful all at once. You can be gentle with yourself and others, recognizing that we're all doing our best with the complexity we're given. Mythology teaches this gentleness, this acceptance of the full range of human experience. Let's think about time for a moment, because mythology changes our relationship with time in interesting ways. Modern life is dominated by linear time, by schedules and deadlines and progress and aging. Time is always moving forward, always running out, always pressuring us. But mythological time is different. It's cyclical, repetitive, eternal. The seasons turn and return. The hero's journey is undertaken by each generation. The same stories are told again and again, never exhausted, always renewable. When you engage with myths, you step out of linear time momentarily. You connect with patterns that transcend any particular moment. The story being told now is the same story that was told centuries ago and will be told centuries hence. In this mythological time, nothing is really lost. The ancestors aren't gone. They're still here in the stories, in the patterns, in the ongoing human journey we're all part of. Past, present, and future collapse into a kind of eternal now, where all the stories are happening simultaneously. This can be comforting. When you're worried about time running out, about getting older, about death approaching. In linear time, yes, your individual life is finite and moving toward its end. But in mythological time, you're participating in something that doesn't end. The stories continue, the patterns persist, the human journey goes on. You're a unique expression of timeless patterns, both mortal and eternal, both temporary and lasting. This double vision, seeing yourself in both linear and mythological time, can ease the anxiety that comes from living only in the forward rush of chronological time. Memory, too, becomes different when you think mythologically. Your personal memories are unique to you, but they're also instances of universal patterns. That moment of joy you remember, that time of sorrow, that experience of wonder or fear or love. These are your specific memories, but they're also variations on experiences humans have always had. Your memories connect you, not just to your own past, but to the human past, to all the joys and sorrows and wonders and fears that have ever been experienced. This makes your memories both more personal and more universal, more precious and more shared. And what about the future? Mythology doesn't predict specific events, but it does offer perspectives on what to expect and how to meet it. There will be challenges, there will be losses, there will also be joys and achievements and moments of grace. Life will follow patterns we can recognize even if we can't control them. We'll face trials that test us. We'll receive help when we need it. We'll be transformed by experiences we can't anticipate. Knowing these general patterns doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it does make the unknown feel less threatening. We're not facing something entirely foreign. We're facing the next chapter in a very old story. The monsters you'll meet might not look like dragons or demons. They might look like illness, or economic hardship, or relationship crisis, or inner darkness. But they're still monsters in the mythological sense, obstacles that must be faced, fears that must be confronted. And the treasures you seek might not be literal gold or magical objects. They might be wisdom, or healing, or authentic selfhood, or meaningful work. But they're still treasures, still worth the journey, still requiring courage and persistence to obtain. Let's think about community and how mythology connects us to others. When you recognize mythological patterns in your life, you also recognize them in others' lives. You see that everyone is on a journey. Everyone is facing dragons. Everyone is seeking treasure. This recognition creates compassion. The person who irritates you, who seems so different from you, is actually wrestling with the same fundamental challenges, just in different forms. They're trying to make meaning, to find love, to overcome fear, to become more fully themselves. Mythology helps you see past surface differences to the universal human story everyone is living. This doesn't erase real differences or excuse harmful behavior, but it does create a foundation for empathy and connection. When someone shares their story with you, you can hear it not just as a string of events, but as a mythological journey. You can recognize the archetypal patterns, the hero's struggles, the descents and returns. And in recognizing these, you honor their experience, validate their journey, let them know they're not alone. This is one of the most generous gifts you can offer another person. Recognition of their story as meaningful and part of the larger human story. Communities form around shared stories, This has always been true. The tribe that gathers to hear myths told, the congregation that shares sacred narratives, the nation united by founding stories, the family passing down its legends, all of these create bonds through shared narrative. In modern life, we might form communities around different kinds of stories. Fans of certain books or movies or shows, members of movements organized around particular visions of justice or progress. But the underlying mechanism is the same. Shared stories create shared identity and belonging. What would it mean to consciously create community around mythological understanding? Not around literal belief in ancient gods, but around recognition that we're all living mythological journeys, that we can support each other through the trials, celebrate the triumphs, learn from the failures, honor the mysteries. This might look like simply being more present with others, really listening to their stories, reflecting back the archetypal dimensions you recognize, offering perspectives from mythological wisdom when appropriate. It might look like creating rituals to mark transitions together, or gathering to read and discuss myths, or simply treating daily interactions with the awareness that you're meeting fellow travelers on the great journey. There's a tenderness in this vision of community, a gentleness that comes from recognizing shared vulnerability and shared nobility. We're all heroes of our own stories, and we're all struggling with limitations, with fear, with the difficulty of being human. Mythology teaches us to take both seriously, the heroism and the struggle. We're capable of remarkable courage and creativity and love. We're also prone to mistakes and illusions and failures. Both are true. Both deserve recognition and compassion. As the night continues its slow turn toward morning, as your body rests deeper into stillness, consider what you might carry from this journey into mythology. Not necessarily specific facts or information, though you've encountered those. More importantly, a sensibility, a way of seeing. The ability to recognize mythological patterns in life. The willingness to see your experiences as meaningful rather than random. The understanding that you're connected to something larger and older than yourself. The courage to face mysteries without demanding they resolve into certainty. The compassion that comes from recognizing shared humanity across time and difference. You might also carry an appreciation for stories, for the narrative dimension of existence. Stories aren't just entertainment or distraction. They're how we make meaning, how we understand ourselves, how we connect with others, how we pass wisdom across generations. Every story you encounter, from ancient myth to modern film to personal anecdote, is an opportunity for insight, for connection, for growth. When you listen to stories with mythological awareness, you hear resonances and patterns that casual listening misses. The stories become richer, more multi-layered, more nourishing. And you might carry a certain kind of peace, the peace that comes from acceptance of life's complexity. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to resolve all paradoxes or answer all questions. You can live with mystery, with uncertainty, with the unknown. Mythology has been doing this for thousands of years, acknowledging what can't be fully understood, creating space for wonder and awe, finding meaning without demanding complete explanation. This is a mature and humble relationship with existence, and it can ease much of the anxiety that comes from trying to control or fully comprehend everything. Think about how mythology validates your inner life, your dreams and imaginings and intuitions. Modern culture often privileges the rational and empirical, which has value, certainly. But mythology reminds us that imagination and emotion and intuition are also valid ways of knowing, also sources of wisdom. Your dreams mean something. Your creative impulses matter. Your emotional responses carry information. Your sense that life has meaning and purpose, even when you can't prove it, deserves respect. Mythology takes the inner life seriously, and in doing so, gives you permission to honor your own depths. There's something about nighttime that makes this easier to feel, isn't there? In darkness, the rational daylight mind quiets, and other ways of knowing emerge. You feel things more than think them. Connections appear that logic wouldn't make. The boundary between inner and outer softens. This is the mythological state of consciousness, and it's always available to you. Not just at night, but any time you allow yourself to sink below the surface of ordinary awareness. Meditation, creativity, time in nature, conversation with beloved others. These can all open this space where mythological understanding lives. What myths ask of us isn't belief exactly, but attention and imagination. They ask us to pay attention to the patterns in our lives and in life generally. They ask us to use our imagination to see beyond surface appearances to deeper meanings. They ask us to take our experiences seriously as parts of meaningful journeys, rather than as random events. They ask us to honor both the personal and the universal dimensions of existence. They ask us to remember that we're not just isolated individuals stumbling through meaningless time, but participants in an ancient and ongoing human story that matters. This remembering is what the word myth originally meant, by the way. In Greek, mythos meant story, narrative, speech, but it was connected to memory, to the act of remembering and retelling. Myths are memories, not of specific historical events necessarily, but of essential truths about human existence. They're what humanity remembers and needs to remember, distilled into story form so it won't be forgotten. When you engage with myths, you're participating in this great act of cultural memory, receiving what's been preserved and passing it forward, changed by your own understanding, but still recognizably part of the ancient stream. And here we are, you and I, at the end of this particular telling. We've spent these hours together thinking about how myths began, how they shape ancient civilizations, how they work in the human mind, how they persist in modern life, how they might guide your own journey. We've traveled from those first storytellers around ancient fires to this present moment, tracing the long thread of narrative that connects all humans across time. And now, as we prepare to part, what remains? Not answers exactly. Mythology doesn't trade in final answers, but perhaps questions that are richer and more interesting than the ones you started with. Perhaps a sense of connection to the long human story. Perhaps recognition of patterns you hadn't seen before. Perhaps comfort in knowing that others have faced what you face and found ways through. Perhaps inspiration to engage more consciously with the mythological dimension of your own life. Perhaps simply a feeling of being accompanied rather than alone, held by stories larger and older than your individual existence. The ancient storytellers knew something we sometimes forget in our modern rush. They knew that some truths are best approached slowly, quietly, in darkness and rest. They knew that the deepest understanding comes not through force or effort, but through receptivity, through allowing yourself to be touched by something larger than your conscious mind can grasp. They knew that stories work their magic, not primarily through the intellect, but through the imagination and heart. And they knew that the telling and hearing of stories is itself a sacred act, creating connection between teller and listener, between past and present, between the personal and the universal. As this night gently draws to a close, as your breath settles into its steady rhythm and your mind drifts in that soft space between waking and sleep, you can simply rest in one quiet knowing. You are part of an ancient story, The myths that sustained humanity for thousands of years are alive in you, shaping your dreams, your hopes, and the ways you understand your life. The heroes, the gods, monsters. They're not only characters in old tales, they're reflections of your own inner world, patterns in your own experience, companions on your path. The wisdom held within mythology isn't trapped in the past. It's here, now, available to you whenever you need guidance, perspective, or meaning. And maybe, most importantly, you're not only receiving these ancient stories, you're also telling one. You are the storyteller of your own life, choosing how to interpret what happens to you, deciding what kind of journey you're on, and who you want to become along the way. This is both your power and your responsibility. To live with awareness, to create meaning, to honor both the timeless patterns and your unique way of expressing them. You are writing the next small chapter of the human story, connected to all who came before you and all who will come after you, both individual and universal, both brief and somehow part of something enduring. For now, the myths are quiet. The stories have been told. The night holds you gently while you rest. Somewhere, someday, someone else will tell these stories again, or stories very much like them, to others who need to hear them, keeping alive the long conversation humanity has been having with itself since the very beginning. The patterns continue. The journey goes on. The stories remain, waiting to be heard, lived, and passed on, again and again, as long as there are people to listen, to wonder, and to feel the strange, deep beauty of being alive. Rest now, dream deeply, and know that within you lives the wisdom of ages, the courage of countless heroes, the creativity of every storyteller who ever lived, and the quiet hope that has carried humanity through darkness into light, over and over again. Through endings and beginnings, loss and renewal, falling and rising, sleeping and waking. The story continues, and you are part of it. Precious, irreplaceable. Your own clear note in a vast symphony, your own small light in the endless constellation of human souls who have wondered, feared, loved, hoped, and told their stories under these same stars. Sleep now. The myths will be here when you wake. They've been here all along, patient and enduring, waiting to be remembered, waiting to guide you home. Good night.